Welcome to episode number 53 of the Debrief here on FingerLakes1.com. I'm Josh Durso, joined today by Ted Baker of Finger Lakes Morning News. We have got a lot of stories and a ton to get to this hour. As always, thanks for joining us if you're listening or watching live on YouTube or the FingerLakes1.com app. If you're catching up on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube, remember to subscribe so you don't miss any episodes in the future. Ted, welcome back.
Always a pleasure.
Man, it has been a while, and the last 3 or 4 weeks of the legislative session in Albany seem to just put everything in like turbo drive. just new proposals, modified proposals, old legislation, new legislation coming a mile a minute. And then when the dust settles, I feel like this is what happens every year. Feels like nothing happened. It's like we're right back to where we started.
No time to read any of it either. Just vote.
Reading is completely overrated, says the reporter. So what do we want to start with? Let's start with some Albany news, but not quite full Albany news. Students who are ineligible for free tuition at New York's public colleges will have to pay more tuition come fall. According to the Democrat and Chronicle, tuition will go up $200 or by 3% for the 2019-2020 school year at their 29 campuses. The Board of Trustees voted on the change on Thursday. It also tacks on like $150 in new fees and $25 in other new fees for certain groups of people. Obviously, New York State is fee crazy and fee happy. What do you make of the news? Obviously, this is the third consecutive year that SUNY has essentially exercised its right to increase tuition the most it possibly can by law. How do you feel about it, and where that sort of leaves us, especially given the kinds of discussions we've been having about public education and then obviously higher education too?
I think we're caught in a spiral right now. I think college costs go up, so then there's calls for increased aid to meet those costs, and when the aid is increased, then the costs go up, and I think we're kind of chasing our tail there. I was thinking about that on the way over today, that the college used to be what the really brainy kids went to gain an advantage. Today, it seems like almost everyone is going to college, and as a result, there's not necessarily an advantage anymore. I think maybe more people ought to go to technical school or learn a trade. I mean, Dave Ramsey on our station rants about people starting off their adult lives hundreds of thousands of dollars in student loan debt for degrees that aren't very marketable.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, right? Because, and it's funny, I listen to that and Clark Howard from time to time, and it seems that they're bringing this very pragmatic mindset to how higher education and how sort of life planning should happen. And it's just interesting because you compare that to the way that these decision makers and policymakers are ultimately creating policy and making decisions for the rest of the state and for the people who live in New York State. And it just seems like there is a absent-mindedness about it. I realize that, $300 in the grand scheme of things, when tuition goes up $300, over a long period of time, if that $300 keeps happening, that becomes a noticeable thing. But just 1 year, it isn't noticeable. But it is the idea that we keep pricing up higher education without acknowledging that it's incredibly unaffordable for even the people who are getting different types of assistance. It's just not contributing to a solution at all.
Well, and I don't think it's a good idea for 22-year-olds to begin their working lives $100,000 or $200,000 in debt. I mean, when you're 33, 35 years old and you're still paying off student loan debt, what's that do to housing sales? I mean, how do young people buy houses or buy anything when they're putting a significant chunk of their income toward paying off their college that they got out of 12 years ago?
Well, and why not just figure out how to address the cost? I mean, if SUNY has to increase their cost to students for whatever the reason, why not try to drive their own expense down so that they don't have to be in this situation? I think that there just needs to be, Dave Ramsey and Clark Howard are great examples of, this sort of mindful budgeting. It doesn't really seem like any of the big institutions, and I know there's always some exceptions with different colleges trying to come up with these new programs to allow more students to get in with less of a burden. But at the end of the day, if your cost is still $50,000, if your cost is still $60,000 or whatever, throw the amount of money on it for 2 or 4 years, you're not changing anything. Nothing is actually changing. And I wonder is it just too complex for folks to want to deal with? Is that from time to time, I feel like that is where we end up in a lot of these policy questions. Is it just something that there isn't the will to deal with because it's too complex? Or is it more sinister? I know some people say, well, there's just, you got a bunch of people pocketing a lot of money in all these institutions, and it's just not fair. And that's pretty much where that line of logic ends.
I think that's part of it. I think if all the federal loan programs and scholarships and aid all went away tomorrow, you'd see college costs come into line real fast. They'd have to. Mm-hmm. I think they're all competing for that pot of money. And then some of the bigger colleges, your Ivy Leagues, are sitting on endowments that are so incredibly huge. I mean, I think Harvard has an endowment of $1 billion or $2 billion or something. They could afford to let every student go free for the next 100 years, and it wouldn't touch the principal on their endowment. Mm-hmm. So at a certain point, you got to ask yourself, what's the mission here? Is the mission to be a $1 billion hedge fund with a school attached, or is it to be a school?
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder, I guess the big question is, or the bigger broad question is, how long or how much longer do you think colleges can operate as is today before they really start to see their bottom lines cut into, because students are just saying, and parents for that matter, are saying this just it isn't feasible anymore. Sorry.
Well, I think some are starting to see that already. I think there's a tremendous pressure on a lot of colleges to keep their enrollment up, and I think in some cases, even not too far away from us as we sit here today, I think there are some that are finding it harder to keep their enrollment up. And I think that's one of the reasons that students and families cite. They say, when you say if tuition's $50,000, $60,000 a year, even with whatever aid, they just go, we can't do it.
And it's interesting. I'm actually thinking about a conversation I had with Steve Keeler from Cuga Community College about a month ago when I was up on their campus. He said that when the state moved to this tuition-free or free tuition policy, it actually hurt their enrollment, and it seems that was the trend across community colleges. While the intent might have been to give more access to everybody, when you can go to a 4-year SUNY school at no cost, just as you can go to a community college at no cost, more students are going to naturally choose the 4-year SUNY schools as opposed to the community colleges. It's just interesting because I think that part of this problem is that I think a lot of degree programs at institutions, especially some of those with a really rich, long history, need to be reimagined. They need to change as much as the institutions themselves and the ways how people pay for college, how you go to college, what the process to get into college looks like. As much as those administrative things need to change, it seems like a lot of the programs within them also need to change. We talk about journalism students a lot. Steve and I have had many conversations on other programs on our network about that. And it's funny, we see some of the community colleges like Cuga Community College, which is really looking at ways that they can change how they build out this program for students, while others seem to be completely content with the way journalism programs and media programs were conducted and built out in 1990. And it just seems to be a strange place, and I think that's a pretty common problem across the educational space. Things have changed, technology has changed, society has changed so rapidly, so much in the last 10 years that it's almost like we need a complete reset across the board.
Well, I know I'm familiar with Finger Lakes Community College. Both my kids went there, and they come on my program once a month. And one of the things that they've done is they've really worked very closely with employers on what skills, both skills specific to the trade and the so-called soft skills, what do you need out of students, and then they tailor their curriculum around that so they're able to turn out students that either go on and finish at a four-year college or in many cases are ready to go right into the workforce with the exact skills that these major employers have said, this is what we need.
I love that you mentioned that because I think that's probably where we need to see the most change is not in modifying. And of course, the old programs need to be modified, need to be modernized. But I think there also needs to be a lot of new programs, new programs that aren't necessarily just trade or just traditional education, but maybe a hybrid of both, and that also work with more local employers. And you know, one of the things I kind of chuckle at from time to time is looking at FLCC's program. While it is awesome and they're turning out 30 to maybe 40 or 50 students per year that wind up working directly at local businesses, you're still only talking about 30, 40, or 50. You're talking about such a small number of, because a lot of these programs are still in sort of their pilot state. And we need to get more of these programs across that threshold so they are moving as many students across the finish line as the traditional 2-year and 4-year paths are, I think.
That's interesting. I also think it's a little bit of a mission change for a lot of colleges. I think a lot of, your typical 4-year liberal arts college has always seen themselves as not in the business of turning out workers, but in the business of shaping minds and teaching people how to think and teaching people reverence for art and things like that. So it'll be interesting to see if they're willing and able to make that adjustment into more of a, I don't think your typical liberal arts college wants to be seen as a vocational school, but maybe they have to be a little bit more that. Otherwise, you get the students that Dave Ramsey talks about that come out with a degree in something that they can't find any job in. So you've got this great degree and you've got all this great knowledge, but you can't find a job with it.
Yeah, so as we mentioned off the top, legislative session, it's come and gone for 2019. Assembly Minority Leader Brian Kolb is calling one-party rule in Albany an unmitigated disaster in an op-ed penned this morning. He says that the best part about the 2019 legislative session is that it's now over. The question is, should anyone be satisfied with the results of this session? No marijuana legalization, no major ground made in any anti-corruption efforts in Albany, nothing with any teeth anyway. The green light bill, which, if nothing else, seems to be very confusing to a lot of people and a lot of county clerks. And then a number of efforts downstate, the farm workers bill, things like that upstate legislators and residents and business owners are just saying are more anti-business measures for upstate New York. I ask that question, should anyone be satisfied with the results? Because it seems like if you have one party that controls everything in Albany, that they should have been able to they had the blank check. They could have written whatever they wanted to write and get it passed. And yet when you talk to Democrats, a lot of them feel like the various things that did happen did not happen to the extent that they thought they should have or would have, or they just feel like there were some outright misses along the way. And then on the other side, you have complete disappointment in everything because it's the ideological flip. So what do you think in terms of real satisfaction? Do you think anyone is completely satisfied with the way this session went, even though it seemed like there should have been maybe nearly 50% of the population in New York State that would have been completely content with the outcome?
I don't think anybody's satisfied. I mean, and the Republicans have every right not to be satisfied because their voice isn't heard at all, and that's not. We see that on the federal level. The House passes bills, the Senate refuses to take them up because the Senate's controlled by the other party. In Albany, nothing happens that the Democrats don't want to happen, and then they can't even get together on what they want. But when I look at it, I've said this a few times, I'm pretty socially liberal. Most people know that. But yet, the things, I mean, to me, if I'm a legislature, if I'm a state government, my job is, what do the people of the state need? What do we need to live happy, productive lives? And I'm just not sure where gravity knives come into that. I mean, some of these things that seem to just come out of nowhere. How about addressing the education issues that we're going to talk about in upstate New York? The economy, and we've talked about this a million times, the decline and fall of rural America. Why don't we address that? I mean, great, you want to legalize pot, you want to give licenses to illegals, you want to codify abortion rights, fine. But there just doesn't seem to be very much focus on kind of bread and butter, kitchen table issues that are going to make my life better. I don't have a gravity knife, and if they legalize them, I still won't have one. And I don't plan on getting an abortion anytime soon. I mean, with all due respect to people, I understand that issue. That I don't mean to be flip in saying that, but it's just issues that really don't have any great effect on our day-to-day lives come front and center, and important things like how do we stop the decline and fall of rural upstate New York are left out there untouched.
Yeah, and we're going to talk more about it, but I don't think there's much interest in touching that subject, and it fascinates me because...
And of course, it's a downstate-dominated legislature. I mean, the Democratic Party in New York State, its population, its power base, and its money are all in downstate New York, and so people in Westchester County don't know a whole lot about dairy farms or factories moving out or anything else that we deal with here in upstate.
Well, and not only that, but those legislators who have power and, frankly, a little bit of control and say in upstate are from the urban areas. They are from Rochester. They are from Buffalo. They are from Syracuse. When I asked myself the question, I sort of was bouncing around those topics that you're hitting on, and again, sort of get back into this area of we're going to talk about the DRI in a little bit, and to me, the DRI is a good example of a check that was written in exchange of real policy. So the governor comes up with a plan to write a $10 million check once a year to a municipality in each region that, exhibits the most signs of life, I guess. And in exchange of that, we lose any kind of meaningful policy in the process. It's gone. There is nothing. Every single year we see all of these headline grabbing issues. That was the thought that came to my mind as you were just running through your thoughts. People like to see the big national issues get tackled at the state and local level, but they don't realize that the issue that is most affecting them is the one that their town board or their village board is making, or in this case, all of the policies that the state and Albany could be working toward to really fix things for, these rural communities. And, maybe, again, this is a scenario where the will isn't there and perhaps the knowledge isn't either to even begin to fix. So if all of these power brokers that live in New York City or in these urban areas, the metro centers around the state, if they don't have any knowledge about how to fix rural upstate New York or any rural part of the state, how are they going to come up? How are they going to be the ones to come up with that solution?
They're not, and they don't see any need because their economy's booming. That needs to be said again. New York City's economy, Long Island's economy, Westchester, the northern suburbs, their economy is booming. There's all kinds of jobs, and they pay good money, and they live in $400,000 homes and drive nice cars. But here in upstate, they don't. And with the power concentrated downstate, and one of the things you mentioned, I saw Brian Kolb's piece, one of the things that he has said year after year after year that he doesn't understand is, he says, I've got bills that would pass if they got to the floor, but the leadership on the Democratic side won't let them get to the floor. 3 men in a room or even fewer sometimes. That's not how democracy is supposed to work. if you bring something up for debate and you hash it out and you vote and you lose, you say, okay, we've tried. But what frustrates the heck out of Republicans in our state government is they don't even get to do that. Their measures die on the vine. They never get to the floor. They don't get voted on. I mean, that's just not the way it's supposed to work. We have two parties for a reason. In a perfect world, we compromise, and I say, all right, I'll give you a little bit of what you want over here. Will you give me a little bit about what I want over here? And at the end of the day, nobody's 100% satisfied, but you get something.
And maybe that sort of speaks to the need for a more streamlined means for these different pieces of legislation to actually get to the floor for a vote. I think every year there's always a report that comes out that says this is how many thousands of bills were acted on. This is how many weren't. And, you do wonder, you sort of mentioned earlier how many of them are actually read, that question. And then the other part of it is how many of them are actually understood.
Well, and I mean, you can't act on all of them. I understand. I mean, there's thousands and thousands of things that get introduced, and some of them are one legislator's pet project for their own district or something. But it was never meant to be that my party's in charge, so your party doesn't count and doesn't get heard. Like I say, it's on the federal level, it's the other way around. It's the Republicans who control the Senate, so nothing that the Democrats want out of the House gets acted on in the Senate, and in Albany, nothing that the Assembly or that the Senate wants or that the Republicans want in either House gets acted on the other side. I mean, if somebody has an idea, let's hear it, let's debate it, and let's decide on it. But let's not just shut it up in a little closet and say, nope, we're not going to discuss this, we're not going to vote on it.
Yeah, and one of the topics, obviously, we're going to get into now, public schools. Inside the Athletics this week took on public schools, looked at the prospect of what they might look like in 10 or 15 years. Lots and lots of discussion about standardized tests, different modes of learning, different programs that sort of engage students in a different way. And now you mentioned this morning, and we started to get into a little bit countywide districts. I know we've talked about this before on the program, but I want to sort of rehash that discussion and also walk through what we feel like the odds of that happening at some point in the next maybe 20 years are. Personally, this is just, my feeling is that there isn't enough at this point, but I think minds are starting to change a little bit on that. I think in rural districts, we talked, I think the last time you were here, we talked about populate enrollment within the districts. And, that is, I think that's part of it. But I also think the bigger part of it might be that it just won't be feasible financially for a lot of these districts to continue operating as they exist today and to continue evolving the way they're going to have to evolve to meet students' needs in the next 10 to 20 years without more mergers, without more countywide districts. I think if we're looking at this objectively, countywide districts are probably the most efficient way to fix the dilemma that a lot of public schools are facing right now. Walk us through sort of where you land on this, having covered and seen this for so long.
Well, it came up, and I don't even remember who it was now, but somebody that was in my studio, we had a conversation, and it was somebody that had been in other parts of the country and couldn't understand, because I guess a lot of places in the country have gone to those big regional models now, where you have a high school with 3,000 students and the graduating class is 750 or something. I guess I'm old-fashioned in this. I like my community school. I like that. I mean, I live in the Marcus Whitman district. My kids went to Marcus Whitman. I think you lose some identity if and I think people at South Seneca would feel the same way. I don't think they want to be in with Waterloo and Minders, but economically, maybe we don't have that choice too much longer because the demographics are against us. The enrollment's going down. So why do we want to pay 4 superintendents $100,000 a year when you could pay one superintendent $100,000 a year And instead of having 4 food service directors, you have 1 food service director. I mean, so there's obviously cost savings there. I think that's the resistance to it is people like their local schools. But there was a day we all liked our little corner markets, and now there aren't that many corner markets, and there are a lot more Walmarts. So that seems to be the trend. We always come back around to societal trends, and that just seems to be the trend for fewer of everything, and the ones we have are bigger stores, bigger schools, bigger everything.
So the question that I think a lot of people have, or maybe it's partly an assumption, is the assumption that if you go to a county model, you're going to have 1 high school, you're going to have 1 middle school, and 1 elementary school for an entire county, and maybe that might be one version or one iteration of...
That's true. I mean, I guess, yeah, there's no... I mean, you can consolidate personnel. That doesn't mean you necessarily have to consolidate buildings. That's a good point.
Right. And so I think about like high school athletics, which tends to be the place where people get most sort of...
Right.
Where the most tribalism is, I guess. And I think that there would be a way to implement it where you wouldn't lose that element of it. You know, you're still going to have more. I mean, use Seneca County or Ontario County or Cayuga County as examples. You couldn't possibly have 1 high school serve the entire county.
Right. I mean, you'd have people that have to go 45 miles on the bus each way.
Right. Yeah. And it wouldn't be feasible. So you would still have these sort of like, you know, using Seneca County as an example, you'd probably have a North Seneca, South Seneca model where like 1 district, but 2 separate systems, so to speak, operating within it. And it's interesting because I think a lot of people get hung up on what administrative folks actually cost districts. They think, well, you know, you'd be cutting Seneca County down, as an example, down to 1 superintendent instead of 4. Okay, I realize that you're literally talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, but when you're talking about the total budgets of these schools, the total cost to educate a human being over the course of 12 years, that's a drop in the bucket compared to the big picture. And I think where you gain the most in a county-wide system, if it were to be implemented the right way, would be the efficiencies of being able to share program resources within the schools, within the district.
Right. Maybe you have a teacher who travels from school to school and teaches a course at this school in the morning and this one in the afternoon. Or if I'm not any expert on school operation, I assume that each district has its own, for example, food service. So maybe you consolidate all the food service and they have better buying power because now I'm buying for 4 schools, so I get a cheaper rate. And everything is cooked in one central place and shipped out or whatever. I mean, there's obviously some efficiencies there. The bigger problem with budgeting for both education and just municipal governments in general is they will tell you the vast majority of their budgets they have no control over whatsoever. They are mandated by the state or mandated by the federal government, especially in education. I've told this story when I do merit badges for scouts sometimes, and one of the requirements for the communications merit badge for Boy Scouts is to attend a government meeting. And you go to a school board meeting, and it's like a different language. Half the time you don't even know what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. And it's all to meet these different mandates that you must have this program and you must have this program, and you have to provide pensions and health insurance and whatever. So that's one of the big problems they face. I think the last time I talked about a school budget with an administrator, I think it's between 70 and 80% of their budgets they couldn't touch if they wanted to. So any cutting, any efficiencies, any savings have to come from literally 20 to 30% of their budget.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because obviously part of what we've learned through this process of creating this new series, looking at public schools, is that learning is leaving the classroom in a lot of cases. So a lot more work programs, a lot more learning with hands-on approach to learning. And if you have a countywide district and you have the ability to create more of a broad classroom where the entire community becomes a classroom. I think that's one of the things that creating a countywide district, it's one of the things that it would accomplish, is it would create more of a community classroom as opposed to a classroom at the South Seneca High School or a classroom in the Romulus, as opposed to doing that. The other thing, of course, and it was really heavily talked about in that particular podcast, federal and state regulations. They're tough. And part of everything that we're talking about is embedded in this concept that really it's going to require the state and federal government to allow for more wiggle room and allow for more change to happen for these classrooms in these districts to be able to start reimagining what they're doing. That's probably the biggest roadblock that a lot of these districts face at this point, is actually the regulation of how learning is supposed to happen. Body counts and desks, things like that. How many days you're actually there. We talk every winter, we talk about that aspect of it, when snow days start getting counted in. All of these state and federal regulations are the roadblock that districts are facing right now. And I'm not sure that just going to a countywide district would solve it, but it might give those districts, or the larger district that would be created, a little more weight behind them, when a little more force when they say, look, this just isn't working anymore. Like, this standardized test that is causing our teachers a lot of harm, causing students a lot of harm, and really isn't preparing anyone for what comes after. They may have to listen. They may actually have to listen under those circumstances. A better voice, maybe.
Well, one of the things that Republicans in state government complain about a lot, and I agree with them 100%, is unfunded mandates. I don't think any level of government should impose a cost on another unless they're willing to pay that cost. I don't think it's right for the state government to tell a community, you must do this, and it's going to cost you this many hundreds of thousands of dollars, but we're not helping you with it. That would be a good start right there, to say to Albany and to Washington, if you're going to make us do something, great, you pay for it. And again, realizing that that's another bigger problem for another day, is that there is no such thing as state dollars or federal dollars or anybody. They're all our dollars. And that's part of why we're in the trouble that we are, is because we've started thinking of them as these different pools of dollars instead of our taxpayer money. But if you're going to impose a requirement on a lower level of government, you ought to have to pay for it.
Yeah, and sort of getting back to the theme of policy and where the most happens in government, it's local, right? The Penn Yan Village Board is holding a special session this morning, Friday, in which it could vote on a moratorium for senior housing. Earlier this week, one person spoke at a public hearing, which was held on Tuesday. The moratorium, if approved, would run or last for 6 months. The debate really seems to swirl around two developers who are in the process of attempting to build townhouse-style rental units on property in Milo and Penn Yan, the village of Penn Yan. Moratoriums, that's really the reason why I wanted to talk about this. Really a fascinating avenue of pursuit for an elected official. Here you are, you're elected to make decisions, to make policy. And a moratorium essentially allows you to just kick the can down the road and not even address it at all. Just say, well, we'll look at this in 6 months, and put everything else that it's connected to directly or through the periphery on hold for that period of time. It is wild to me that this is still something that can be approved. It's almost as if, or approvable, I should say. This is almost to the level of Jackie Augustine is frequently talking about government incompetence. This seems to even go beyond incompetence to a point where it's like, we just don't want to do our jobs, so this moratorium allows us to not do our job.
It can be that. I think usually what seems to happen is somebody gets caught a little bit by surprise. Something moves a little more quickly than they thought, and all of a sudden decision time is here and they realize that we really haven't discussed this and really haven't planned for it. I think another part of it is sometimes by kicking the can down the road, your problem goes away. So if one of the developers says, you know what, I'm not waiting 6 months, I'll go to a town that wants me and build it there. I guess I don't have a real problem with a moratorium so much as the length of some of these things. I mean, to decide whether or not it's a good idea for some new housing to be built, it probably shouldn't take 6 months. I mean, that's something where why don't you go home and do your research and come back at the next meeting in 2 weeks or a month and figure it out. I don't know what all the issues are in this particular case. I know, usually it's somebody objects who lives right next door and they don't want, 70 apartments to go up next door to their house all of a sudden. But, it seems to me that's why we have zoning and that's why we have a planning board and we have all these processes in place when somebody wants to build. So I'm not really sure why we have to say, okay, time out now and we're going to make no decision. And meanwhile, somebody's probably already incurred costs. They've bought this property. Maybe they've started putting in some infrastructure. And now here comes the town telling them you can't do anything for 6 months.
Well, and we've seen it a lot with the solar movement, obviously, in Farmington and in Ontario County. We've seen a few of these stories pop up where moratorium is explored just to prevent or stop some development from happening. It's interesting because it's like the question I ask is like, okay, so if you need a moratorium and it's justifiable, what steps are you taking to address whatever concerns prompted said moratorium? So are you weighing? So this looks at rental units and rental properties. I would assume that Penn Yan isn't much different than any other community where access to affordable housing, rental units, affordable rental units, and then also senior housing is lackluster. Tends to be the case pretty much everywhere. And I would also assume that Penn Yan and Yates County probably does not have, or they probably do not have a mechanism to keep track of how many units they have versus how many units they need or what the population looks like. We've talked about repeatedly that legislation that has been proposed in Auburn, in the city of Auburn several times, to create that mechanism, create that system. If you don't have those things, how can you just say, well, we need to put a moratorium on this? If you're making a decision. By not making a decision, you're making a decision based on bad information, or worse yet, no information. And that's where I sit and I scratch my head and I say, okay, politically it doesn't make sense. For the residents, it doesn't make sense. And then you turn the next page and you say, for economic development, when we're talking about these rural communities dying, it also doesn't make sense. So where do you draw? I guess where does the line get drawn? And then, if a 6-month moratorium is put into place, are you going to make a real decision? Are you going to generate real policy in the next 6 months so that the moratorium is lifted and not renewed, and you replace that with some substantive policy? I mean, an argument, a perfectly feasible argument could be that you can't come up with it. So if somebody said, okay, show us the data, show us why this is a bad idea, the village, it probably wouldn't even be able to come up with, or the village board probably wouldn't even be able to come up with that data, with that information in a 6-month period.
Well, and one would think, who would know better what need there is for housing than a housing developer? Presumably, if a housing developer has decided to put up housing units, he must believe there's a demand for them. So if, this is where I get less liberal and more conservative. If somebody is demanding a product or service and someone else is willing to provide that product or service, then what do we need government for at all? Get out of the way. Let them do it. If you want to sell me something and I want to buy it, whose business is that of anybody's? And I mean, if that's why we have zoning. Again, I guess I've always been a little bit of the opinion that if you don't want someone to do something on the property next to yours, buy it.
Yeah, and I think part of this story also is the one person who spoke at that hearing on Tuesday was Alan Knopf he is the legal representation of one of the developers who earlier filed an Article 78 against the zoning board because of their. So I'm just jumping out on a limb here. I'm going to say that like most rural, small, shrinking communities in the Finger Lakes, they have outdated, unfit zoning regulations that probably side more with what life and business were like in these communities maybe 40 years ago as opposed to what it is now, what reality is now. And there again, you really if you're going to make a statement like saying this project can't happen or we need to put a 6-month pause on all projects like this, you have to come up with something meaningful afterward to address it.
Well, that's a really good point because it seems like typically that's how zoning changes are done. All of a sudden somebody looks up and says, gee, it's been 30 years since we've done our zoning. We better update it. And I think that's a very good point because what people want is changing. More and more people want walkable downtowns. They want to be able to have a mix of retail and residential or offices and residential in the same area. And a lot of municipalities just have not really thought about it. I just talked to Mark Venuti, Geneva supervisor. They just approved an updated zoning map there. And that was the very thing he said was, gee, we looked around and realized that what we had for zoning was based on the way life was in 1970-something, and we better update.
Well, as we look at a lot of these communities, and we both say they're shrinking, okay, they're here you have these shrinking communities, and who's left? Odds are most of the people who are left in the communities are the ones who are completely fine with maintaining what was 40 years ago. They like that. That's why they stay there. That's why they're the only ones who haven't been priced out of a lot of these communities. And that becomes the problem when you have those individuals ultimately with the most control in these different places. And I know there's an argument for, well, they're the ones who make up the community. They should be able to. But we're talking about it's an existential threat, right? Like if there is not enough housing for young people when these older folks ultimately are no longer living in these communities, who's left? What's left? Like there has to be some proactive steps taken to make sure that you're not just preserving what was past quality of life, but you're ensuring that future existence can happen. And we're seeing it in Penn Yan with obviously they won the $10 million DRI last year. Steve Griffin has been on the show on my show multiple times, talking about all of the great things that are happening in Penn Yan, around Penn Yan. They have all the opportunity in the world, but even all of that, with all of that good, if you have these different forces or outdated things that are preventing change from happening or preventing new ideas and new business to be inserted into it, you're only going to get so far.
Well, yeah, I mean, those great things aren't going to keep happening if people can't find a place to live. It doesn't do me any good to open up a business if I can't get any workers because they can't afford to live. I assume, and I could be off base in this assumption, that part of the opposition to this is the fact that it's rental units, because obviously there's a picture people get about renters versus owners. So, all right, if you don't want so many renters, then what are we going to do to make home ownership more affordable? Because that, for a lot of people, because they have $200,000 in student loan debt, to circle back around, they can't afford to buy a house. So I guess, and we're getting into one of our themes again here, which is the tendency of government to look at the headline or crisis of the day rather than the big picture of what do we want our community to look like in 20 or 30 or 50 years, and what do we have to do to get there?
Mm-hmm. So we're going to, as we start to close in on the hour mark here, we got about 15 minutes left. Let's get some reader questions in. Obviously, we have a bunch because we haven't been here in 3 weeks. So first one pops up. It has to do with the DRI, this year's DRI. It's become clear that Canandaigua and Newark are finalists. There may be some other finalists, but we don't know if there are or aren't. One reader asked, finalists aside, now are the ones who have come forward. Who do you think wins this year in the Finger Lakes? So what should the expectations be, I guess, is what the reader's asking, in terms of who we think will win for the Finger Lakes region?
It's hard to say because, I think if you were thinking in terms of need, I would say Newark probably needs revitalization more than Canandaigua, which is a pretty affluent community on its own, a bedroom community to Rochester. There's a lot of development going on there anyway, but I don't think that's necessarily the criteria that they use. It's more what your plans are, what you're going to do with that money. So it would be very hard to try to handicap. I'm certainly no economic development expert, but it would seem to me that in terms of need, you'd want to see Newark get it.
And I think, sort of piggybacking off of that, I think Newark has shown the most in terms of organizational leadership as a municipality and in terms of just being able to get things done, see a plan all the way through. Of course, Seneca Falls is one of those communities that has come up. There hasn't been any official word if they're a finalist or not. But I think given that Newark was essentially runner-up last year, just given the trend line, it would seem that they would probably be the winner this time around. But Canandaigua, like Auburn, is another one of those communities that, obviously Auburn in the CNY in central New York. I think Canandaigua is one of those flashy communities that could just win if those who are making the decision are just looking to sort of have the most eye-grabbing pick come out this time around.
But you kind of have to ask yourself a little bit. I mean, look at some of the development. The Lakeshore development has what was all kinds of big promises, and what we've had so far is some apartments, frozen yogurt place, and a beer place, and that's fine with me because I like beer places. But that development hasn't progressed the way that we were told it was going to. Over on the other side of the lakefront, we have a skeleton of a hotel that we're told is going to maybe turn into something. So, and that's what I wanted to get to in this whole thing, is I keep saying the approach to economic development is backwards. You don't build a factory over here because you think you want to build a factory. You build a factory because there's been a demonstrated demand for what you're going to make in that factory. You want to boost economic development, get more money into the hands of the middle class, and they will spend it. You can't create demand. The demand has to be there. So if I'm going to build Ted's Widget Factory, then I need to know that there's a lot of people that want to buy widgets. If I find a place where people are going, I want widgets, that's where I'm going to build my widget factory. The approach we're taking is, here's money, build it, and they will come. But they won't if they have no money to spend on whatever that product is. I mean, Infotonics. Oh, Infotonics, greatest thing since sliced bread. And to this day, what's it amounted to? It's unless there's a demand for that product or service out there, building something shiny and new isn't going to cut it.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I want to go to the Cuomo question next, which popped up. Brianna from Victor says, quote, I voted for Governor Cuomo the last 2 times he ran. I'm a Democrat, and I think he did a good job. But I see he's running again or has announced intent to do so. I can't see myself voting for him again. Am I alone? End quote. I thought that question was really interesting because after I saw a few of these headlines, I was like, that's interesting, because that seemed to be the prominent feedback on social media, even from Democrats who have supported him pretty strongly the last 2 times around. So I guess the question is she? Do you think there's enough of that to prevent him from to prevent Cuomo from gaining a fourth term?
No.
Don't think so.
That's simple. No,
really?
No. There's no. I mean, look at the Republicans have tried time after time after time. There's just, this is a Democratic controlled state because, again, the people and the money and the power are downstate. I just don't see. There is that factor, definitely. I think there is definitely a Cuomo fatigue factor. I think people have tired a little bit of the ego, but I just don't. I think if he wants it, he gets reelected.
Is there enough, though, to perhaps force another primary? And maybe this time around, a primary with a little more mainstream support for the challenger, as opposed to what was this past time around with Cynthia Nixon challenging Cuomo. Maybe something more with more of that mainstream support that's necessary to win a primary. Could he be challenged out from his own party? Because that, to me, that's what these comments are signaling. These comments, to me, are signaling that there is going to be some real thirst among Democrats for another candidate. Not saying that they're going to go vote for a Republican if it comes down to that, but saying that if presented with the opportunity to choose another Democrat over him, they would choose another.
I think it's too tall a hill to climb. I don't think you can raise enough money. The governor's got money, and he's got the power of the state government. And everybody wants to back a winner. So do you want to be the guy who endorses Cuomo's opponent, and then he's reelected, and guess what? Your town doesn't get the $10 million next time around. It doesn't even get looked at. I mean, that's the reality of politics. Everybody wants to endorse the winner. I mean, the earlier you do, the better. I mean, look at Donald Trump. A lot of Republicans, when he first started running, which was about this time in the last cycle, nobody wanted him as president. But the more likely it became that he would be the nominee and then be elected, the more people started to endorse him. So I just, if I'm any kind of municipal sort of power broker, do I want to go out on a limb and endorse a challenger and have that challenger lose to a guy with a long memory?
It's interesting. I think it would especially be interesting if that person were Bill de Blasio. I think that given it's obviously going to take somebody with a whole lot of energy and a whole lot of power down in New York City to
and
challenge.
A huge amount of money.
And a whole pile of money. But I think there are enough people in New York City who fit that criteria or could fit that criteria in a few more years to make that happen. And I think it would be interesting. I think it would be very interesting to see, because you would have the traditional sort of old school political machine versus what would be viewed as a grassroots effort, even if it were a very corporate effort or very corporate effort, feeling effort from New York City. So that part of it, to me, that would be interesting. If I'm putting a percentage on it, I guess I'm still in like the 40 to 45% range. I'm not quite to 50-50, but I'm getting close to 50-50 in terms of thinking he could be ousted by his own party the next time around.
But the other thing is, from a practical standpoint, if you're a Democrat, what do you have not to like about Andrew Cuomo? I mean, he's pushed, he didn't get everything, but he's pushed a lot of social things through. Social liberals have to be pretty happy in New York. We didn't get legalized marijuana, but probably will eventually, or at least decriminalization. As I said, the downstate economy is booming. So if I'm a Democrat who lives, again, I'll keep saying Westchester, Long Island, whatever, what is there not to like about the Cuomo administration? I've got a good job. My economy's booming. My house is great. If I'm a social liberal, I'm getting a lot of the things that I've always talked about that almost no other states in the country are getting. I mean, California, New York, Massachusetts, there aren't too many places other than that where any sort of liberal social agenda is making any kind of progress. So, it's one thing to be dissatisfied and go, the guy's got a big ego and blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, he's pretty well delivered if you're a Democrat. Now, if you're an upstate Republican, you don't think so.
Right, and I think it's kind of interesting because the last question that I picked for today came from Melissa in Canandaigua, who asked, did New York miss a big opportunity by not legalizing recreational marijuana?
Yes, but it's social change takes time, and that's what it took a long time to get rid of slavery in this country. It took a long time to get voting rights. It took a long time, LGBTQ rights are on the increase. So I think eventually we'll get that, and I'm in favor of it because I think we spend way too much money. You want to free up money for better uses. Let's stop throwing nonviolent drug offenders in jail for long periods of time, and let's let people put whatever substance into their body to get high they want, because we've been doing it, since Adam discovered the apple, or Eve discovered the apple and gave it to Adam, whichever way it was. I forget sometimes.
And I do want to fit in one more quick question. Ryan Fayette asked, is it only a matter of time before we start to see elected positions turn to appointed ones? Fayette Town Board this past week killed the idea of moving their highway superintendent to an appointed position as opposed to it being an elected one. It's something that we've talked about here before. Jackie and I have talked about it before. Is there a point in time in the relative near future where we think we get over the hump and it just starts happening out of necessity because maybe some people just enough people aren't running for these positions? I think that's what the question's really getting at.
Well, I think it would probably be a good idea because why do we turn people into politicians who really aren't? The highway superintendent, he just wants to get in the truck and plow. He doesn't want to go out and shake hands and raise money and come up with bumper stickers and everything. To me, it's, we have professional city managers in many communities now, so it would seem to make sense to take some of these things out of the political realm. And presumably, if you have qualified people making the choices, you get better people that way rather than somebody who runs for a position simply because he thinks it would be fun to make a few extra bucks.
Right. And, of course, where can everybody hear you? Where can they listen to you Monday through Friday?
We're on the Finger Lakes Morning News on Finger Lakes News Radio. That's 95.9 FM and 1240 AM, WGVA in Geneva. It's 98.1 FM and 1590 AM, WAUB in Auburn.
And that's it. That's all for this week. We'll be back next week. Until then, keep reading, keep listening, keep doing all that stuff. See you guys.